If your home was being searched without your knowledge, your private conversations monitored and recorded, your every move tracked and stored, would you feel violated? These are the questions many Americans have asked in regard to the Patriot Act, which was passed in 2001 and reinstated in 2006. The Patriot Act allows law enforcement officials to obtain a search warrant anywhere terrorist or domestic terrorist activity is suspected. It also increases the penalties for those who commit terrorist acts. The Act also widens the surveillance powers of the National Security Agency. Our Fourth Amendment specifically states that we can't be searched unless there's probable cause. Michael Hayden, the former director of the National Security Agency and the former director of the CIA, gives us his interpretation of the Fourth Amendment.
My understanding is that the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution specifies that you must have probable cause to be able to do a search that does not violate an American's right against unlawful searches and seizures.
Actually, the Fourth Amendment actually protects all of us against unreasonable search and seizure.
But
that's what it says.
The measure is probable cause, I believe.
The amendment says unreasonable search and seizure.
But does it not say probable?
No.
The court standard, the legal standard,
search and seizure.
the legal standard is probable cause.
Just to be very clear, okay, and believe me, if there's any amendment to the Constitution that employees of the National Security Agency are familiar with, it's the Fourth, right? And it is a reasonableness standard in the Fourth Amendment.
To quote the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in its entirety, the one the General and the NSA folks are so familiar with and know is about reasonableness and not about probable cause, quote, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
If the responsibility of our national security officials is to protect Americans, shouldn't they know what our rights are? But specifically, how does the Patriot Act infringe upon our freedoms? According to the American Civil Liberties Union, the Patriot Act threatens our First, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Eighth, and 14th Amendments. The Act expands terrorism laws to include domestic terrorism, which could subject political organizations to surveillance. It allows law enforcement officials to conduct secret searches. It allows FBI agents to investigate American citizens for criminal matters without probable cause. They told us that the Patriot Act was necessary to fight terrorism, so why is it being used to terrorize us? In fact, in 2007, a woman served 3 months in jail for spanking her child and being unruly to an attendant on board a flight to Denver. In 2002, a photographer in Denver was arrested and detained for hours for taking pictures of a hotel that Dick Cheney was staying in. His camera equipment was also confiscated. In 2004, an artist and professor at New York State University was arrested on charges of bioterrorism. He had laboratory equipment at his home in preparation for an upcoming art exhibit. The art exhibit took a stance against genetically modified foods. After 4 years of fighting for his freedom, the charges were finally dropped. And there is still more.
Last September in St. Paul, Ramsey County prosecutors formally charged 8 members of the group RNC Welcoming Committee with conspiracy to riot in furtherance of terrorism. The 8 activists are believed to be the first people ever charged under the 2002 Minnesota version of the federal Patriot Act. The activists face up to 7.5 years in prison. The criminal complaints filed by the Ramsey County attorney reportedly do not allege any of the defendants personally engaged in any act of violence or damage to property. Instead, authorities are seeking to hold the 8 defendants responsible for acts committed by other individuals during the opening days of the Republican National Convention.
I have 4 felony counts that I'm facing: conspiracy to commit riot in furtherance of terrorism, conspiracy to commit riot, conspiracy to commit criminal damage to property in furtherance of terrorism, and conspiracy to commit criminal damage to property.
Lutza, what were you doing at the Republican Convention?
Well, at the convention, I was in jail. I'd been in jail since the Saturday before, but I did spend more than a year and a half beforehand organizing with a group called the RNC Welcoming Committee, and we were primarily an infrastructural, logistical group, bringing together a lot of different people for radical protests at the convention.
In this case, where you have people who are locked up in jail while the convention protests were going on, aren't accused of having or doing anything that could cause any harm to other people, and yet they're being charged with felony terrorist charges.
I think the significance is that this is one more step in the process of criminalizing dissent. Of course, people were outraged when the Patriot Act passed in the first place, and then state versions were passed across the country, and it's significant anywhere that people would be prosecuted as terrorists for involving themselves in political dissent of any nature. And of course, it's not about necessarily agreeing with our politics or towing any sort of party line. It's the fact that we do have a right to protest. Any prosecution under a Patriot Act or any similar legislation infringes on those rights.
The Patriot Act seems to create fear, and it undermines our civil liberties. How did this legislation get passed?
In the Senate, they called it the United in Strengthening America Act, and in the House, they called it the Patriot Act, providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorist acts. And the compromise was to call it both, the USA Patriot Act. But the real purpose behind those names, of course, was to suggest that anyone who would criticize it is unpatriotic, is a traitor.
When the Patriot Act was first sent to the Congress by the Bush administration, it came with a request that we hold no hearings on it so that there would be no public input or public discourse.
That might have even been somewhat acceptable had it been the bill that was considered by and adopted unanimously by the committee, but it wasn't.
For 6 weeks previously, Congress had debated how to address law enforcement needs in the wake of 9/11, and eventually a bill was crafted that had bipartisan support.
To have Bob Barr on the far right, Barney Frank far left, agree was an amazing feat.
We came up with a draft of the bill that did have very, very broad support across the Judiciary Committee. Unfortunately, it was then changed in a last-minute draft before it came up on the floor.
Sometime very late in the evening after midnight, the John Ashcroft version, Bush White House version, was substituted.
The bill was printed at 3:45 a.m. the morning before the vote on the House floor. And you tell me how many of the 435 members of Congress had a chance between 3:45 a.m. and 11 a.m. to read a bill that was 345 pages long.
Give us a weekend to read it, and let's take it up Monday morning. Hey, I'll come in and vote at 7 o'clock on Monday morning if it's that urgent.
No member of Congress read this legislation before it was voted on. Not a one.
This is still warm. It just came off the Xerox machine. This isn't the bill that was adopted by a unanimous 36 vote majority of Democrats and Republicans of the Judiciary Committee. These are critical issues. This is what we're fighting for. These are our civil liberties.
If the system is manipulated, how valid is the outcome? It may seem that the Patriot Act was only relevant during the Bush administration, but it's still a law today. In fact, when President Obama was a senator, he voted to reinstate the Patriot Act in 2006. But there's good news. As of April 2nd, 2009, over 414 local counties and states have passed resolutions that have either repealed provisions of the Patriot Act or have passed resolutions that protect our civil liberties. Citizens united for a common cause can make a difference, so let's make our voices heard in every city.